welcome to this Preparing for 2020 Summit presented by the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School with your hosts Daniel Giamario and Caylin Castelle. And today our guest speaker is Henry Seltzer. More about him in a moment. First, just to say that this summit is about creating awareness around the remarkable planetary alignments happening in 2020, a year that implies 2020 vision. The intent of this summit is based in the understanding that we inform the mysteries as much as they inform us. We have invited a variety of presenters, both from an astrological perspective and a variety of other transformational approaches to help us understand and then offer practical approaches for navigating the incline towards 2020. And Daniel's going to introduce our speaker.
And today it's my great pleasure to introduce Henry Seltzer, one of my absolute favorite people to hang out with at conferences. He's also been a friend and somewhat aware of shamanic astrology over the years. And I particularly wanted to invite him here because of his very unique and right at the leading edge of our awareness about Eris and how she fits into the unfolding scenario taking place now as we move up toward the dramatic and interesting and unusual alignments of 2020. So, Henry, tell us a little bit more about yourself and maybe a little bit about your background, and then take it away as far as what you want to share with us today in our summit.
Okay, well, thank you, Daniel. Very good. Thanks for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be part of this. I think it's exactly what we need to do right now is focus on these next few years leading up to 2020. Not only because of the astrological alignments, but also because of the political alignments, because that's our next presidential election here in the United States, coincidentally, or perhaps not. But I can tell you a little bit about myself that I created the time passages software for astrology because I was very interested in trying to demonstrate astrology for people just to get a real handle on how significant this information can be. So it was just standard Western astrology that I was producing, and I got very interested in Chiron at some point also, which is one of our points of contact between you and me, Daniel. And then as I was doing all this and just on the normal run of the mill astrology work, and readings too, of course, I was fascinated when they named a new planet because my scientific background, I was actually at one point a physics major at MIT, believe it or not, even though I also was always interested in the humanities side, and I wound up finding the perfect balance in being able to do astrology, which is, of course, a combination of the scientific precision and also the mystical interpretation. But you know, so my scientific mind was triggered because here they said, well, Pluto is actually this category now of Kuiper belt objects we're going to call dwarf. And there's another one, which is, at the time they thought it was bigger than Pluto. It turns out to be about the same size as Pluto, but brighter and more massive. So arguably, the bigger or the more interesting and more powerful, perhaps by size, objects in the Kuiper belt. The only two really large ones are Pluto and Eris. And then Maki Maki and Haumea were also named and as dwarf planets. And they are the first planets. I call them planets because we call Pluto a planet. Still, we work with Pluto very much so in astrology. We're not stopping. And I saw the possibility that Eris could be considered just as important as Pluto in charts. I didn't think that was likely, but I thought it was worth investigating. And my research actually was what confirmed that it's very powerful in charts. The house that it's in is an important house. If it makes a good contact with a natal planet, personal planet, that personal planet is emphasized. Good example I always use is the chart of Carl Jung, because he had an Eris-Mercury trine that was partile. And so Mercury being elevated in importance is so interesting with him, who he lectured in 3 languages, his collected works have come to 18 volumes, and he was involved with the spirit Mercurius in his later researches when he went into alchemy studies. So, I mean, it was just, so it just jumps out at you. And he had Eris in the first house, very strong there. And anybody with a strong Eris is somebody that really pursues their own idea to the exclusion of whatever the prevailing sentiment is. A good example is Blake, who had Pluto-Uranus square, pretty close, but Eris really completes that because it's conjunct Pluto and square Uranus, more precisely. So anyway, and you can see in Blake's work what an iconoclast he was. I mean, he was totally in his own world as far as what he brought forward. A bit of a disruption, a bit of a, it's associated with chaos, Eris. Because of the name, it's the goddess of chaos and discord, but it's also, to my way of thinking, a feminine warrior energy, being the sister of Pluto. I'm sorry, not Pluto, cousin of Pluto, because they're both out there in the Kuiper Belt. But what I'm trying to say is the sister of the god of war, namely Mars. So I thought of Eris as a feminine warrior energy right from the very beginning. And I present all the evidence that I've accumulated, which was massive, and even more since the book came out about a year and a half ago, about that. I couldn't find a leader in the feminist movement from the 1700s onward that did not have strong Eris fighting for what they most deeply believed. And I came to understand it as a feminine warrior rather than a masculine warrior energy, in the sense that it's fighting for what you most deeply believe. A mother might have a knife in her hand cutting up bread, and she might use it if her child is threatened. She's not doing this out of gratuitous violence. She's not trying to show off or be macho, but she's acting out of deep need. And this is what I came to understand as a feminine warrior, as opposed to the more traditional masculine warrior. And of course, now we have so many evidences of the feminine warrior, including the Women's March on Washington, which was a week after the inauguration, including the campaign of Bernie Sanders, which was, well, I'll get into that later when I talk about Eris Uranus. So here's my book. Can I show you my book? It's called The 10th Planet, and there's so much evidence in this book about what I'm talking about. All the charts that really demonstrate how Eris is powerful in certain people's charts, people that kind of go against the grain and come up with their own way of doing things. I don't remember your chart, Daniel. I'm sure it has a strong Eris in it.
Henry, some years ago, before the book came out, you actually were questioning me about Eris and how it connected with my own chart and my own experience with the feminine. And it was just, what you wrote was exactly my experience.
So, Henry, just quickly, you can get your book on Amazon or from your website. How do they get it?
Well, it is on Amazon. It's also available directly from Wessex Astrologer, which is the publisher in England.
Cool.
For a long time now, Eris has been back and forth over my descendant.
Relationship stuff.
Which is really, other than shamanic astrology, the primary theme of my life has been wild, amazing, transformational, and eccentric, different than normal, but powerful women.
Yep. I don't remember who it was, but another astrologer at one of the conferences had Eris natally on his descendant, and I described to him the kind of woman that he was with, and he said, "Oh, you're understating it." He said, "Oh my God," So that was kind of.
We had a similar conversation about it.
Oh yeah, probably so. Well, what I started to say was that you mentioned transits. Eris moves so slowly; it takes 120 years to go through Aries. So at first, I thought, wow, you can't really do much with transits, because it's always at the same degree after years. It's a quarter of a degree average per year. Of course, it moves back and forth with the retrogradation, with the Earth's movement, a couple of degrees, but it still only makes progress about a quarter of a degree per year if you average it out with 120 years in Aries, because that's the eccentricity, that's the aphelion of its orbit, the furthest it is out.
Listening to this will have Eris and Aries, right? Because
So everybody has Eris and Aries. Now, not Einstein, though. Einstein had it in Pisces, all right? And the reason I bring up Einstein, it's in chapter 3 of my book. I was quite interested to note that Eris was kind of not too far from his sun, both in the 10th house, and he did become the most recognizable and well-known scientist in the world at Shock of Wild Hair. But, you know, as Eris moved, you know, quite slowly, to the point where it conjuncted his sun, backed away, conjuncted again, and then finally stationed on his sun degree in late 1905. It was the year I felt of his Eris on his sun, and I thought, what's 1905 in the biography of Einstein? It's his Annus Mirabilis, they call it, which is his miracle year when he wrote the theory, wrote a paper on the theory of relativity, the very first paper on that. 5 other papers that, 4 other papers, 5 papers in all that shook the foundations of physics in many ways. You know, the photoelectric theory won the Nobel Prize for that. But anyway, that's when I realized Eris by transit could be powerful, because even though it moves slowly, when it makes those exact hits, it does ring a bell.
Yeah,
So it's quite interesting to look at that. And then in more recent times, Eris and Uranus are in this cycle. They were exact in June of 2016. And in June of 2016, if you'll recall, is when we had the US presidential election with surprise after surprise after surprise, with Uranus involved. And so and of course they stayed close together, and they conjuncted again in March of 2017. And interestingly, the conjunction goes on until 2020 by the 15-degree orb that Rick Tarnas uses for these things, as he published in Commitments in Psyche, that there's this period of influence that, you know, and of course, with Uranus-Pluto, we have that as well, and that goes on till 2020, I believe. So we have Uranus-Pluto in this decade of the teens. The exact hits were back in 2013, 2015, but yet it still goes on. It's the aftermath that's sometimes the most important. Like, for example, you can see in the 60s, the period was 1960 to 1972 for Uranus-Pluto, and 65 was really, for many, many people, just the beginning of the recognition that, by God, things have changed. I remember in 1969, everybody had long hair, and all of a sudden, and you could go to Kansas and you would find people with long hair and LSD experiences. So it was really taking over.
University of Kansas, and we had a huge contingent of counterculture there. We were called the Berkeley of the Midwest. That was 68, 70.
What town is that?
Lawrence, Kansas.
Lawrence, that's right. Yeah, I think I was in either Lawrence or Manhattan, Kansas, right after, right in the end of '69. But anyway, so what about Uranus with Eris? Well, you know, that's an empowering of Uranus, and an empowering of Uranus in a way of shock and awe and sudden surprise. And what we see in this time frame is we see the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, right? Came out of nowhere, a man really articulating what he totally believes himself. All that was about was, I've got to speak up. I can't sit still any longer. And that's been spreading. You know, there's so many, the capital R resistance to the conservative empowerment that put Donald Trump in the White House has been extreme. There's been all this. I mentioned the Women's March on Washington. There was also Standing Rock, very strong. People standing up for themselves, people saying water is life. Our water is threatened. This is our life. This is our livelihood, our lives here. And, you know, they made their stand. They didn't succeed, but it was a very good stand and very, very important, I think.
It puts in motion, actually, I think, because there's still stuff going on around that we're not hearing about.
And the rest of the world.
Yes, it's still going on, absolutely.
The Brexit phenomena was also part of the same kind of situation, the same other parts of the world also, not just the U.S.
You know, that's interesting, too, because of June 2016, of course. In March or April of that year, I was aware that the first exact hit of Uranus was going to be in June of 2016 and at 23 degrees of Aries. And I thought to myself, isn't that when the Brexit vote is happening? And so then I looked, and in the 1801 chart for the UK, which is the chart published in Campion's book, The World Horoscopes, Saturn is at 23 degrees of, I believe it was a trine to Saturn, so it must be another fire sign. Let's see, no, that's not right, is it? I forget exactly where Saturn is in the UK chart. But anyway, it was at 23 degrees, and I said, And then it turned out retrograde Mars was at 23 Scorpio at that same time. And retrograde Mars would be kind of taking a step backward. It would be standing up for an internal attitude. And with that combined with the Uranus-Eris exact conjunction, making, I think it was a trine aspect to his Saturn, to the UK Saturn, I said, by God, they're going to pull out. This was in May. And I published these results in the UK, and I became, known a little bit for that I predicted that, and I even tried to place a bet on the outcome in the favor of the exit, but I wasn't able to place the bet because they only wanted people with a UK address. And none of my friends in England would place the bet for me. They were all saying, you're crazy. So I couldn't get the bet down, but otherwise I was pretty convinced, from the Eris-Uranus on the UK Saturn.
One of my buddies over in England, in Wales, Robin Heath, an explorer of megalithic sites, but also an astrologer, published a piece in Mountain Astrology. He basically showed why Brexit and Trump prevailed. So he's like one other person who actually did deduce that. And he put that in Mountain Astrologer. I can't remember whether he included Eris in the calculation or not, but there's very few of you anyway. Yes.
Well, the Trump thing, I never thought, even Trump said, this is an indication that I'm going to win this election. And I couldn't go with that. I mean, it seems so impossible, a completely unqualified person that was a reality TV star. But it was a surprise. As I say, there was so much. All that summer, I was able to say, well, you've seen a lot of surprises so far, like Trump being the candidate, but you ain't seen nothing yet. And then something else would happen. I would say, you ain't seen nothing yet. And then, Comey would announce that there was more investigation of Hillary's email server, and the Russians would release emails from the DNC and all this crazy stuff, including right up to the Electoral College, when there was a movement to say he's not qualified, let's let the Electoral College be the filter it was intended to be on the presidential choice, but of course that never happened. And all the surprises since, including March, you see, was the exact hit again. So we've just seen, I would say, a scandal a week and further allegations every time, and so many strange things coming out, including the strange tweets from the president himself, that don't make sense. But anyway, it's just a very revolutionary time period. And if you look at the 15-degree orb on this, it goes right up to 2020. So, I mean, we should talk about what we actually, the topic of your seminar or your summit is about what's happening right now. And I believe that what's happening right
now, and what Eris fits into that time frame of the very rare Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, all in Capricorn.
Yes, exactly. And of course, that's so interesting and so powerful. And I'm sure many of your speakers will touch upon that. I think that is very interesting. And then the follow-up of the Jupiter-Saturn exact hit on December 21st of 2020.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated to note that at that time, when Jupiter, Saturn are exact at 0 degrees of Aquarius, Pluto is still in Capricorn at 23, which is putting it within orb of a square to the U.S. Pluto, about to be the Pluto return of the U.S. not till 2022. But, the fact of the matter is your Eris is still sitting at 23 Aries, which is where it was during the election. It moves back and forth so slowly. I mean, it goes a little ahead and then gets back. So that 23-degree mark of Eris in Aries is exactly square to Pluto in Capricorn. And so that really amps up the whole Pluto situation of transformation. So it's just one more piece in that interesting concept that we're headed for something major here with the Uranus-Pluto running out through the rest of this decade, and with Eris-Uranus right now being very close, but petering out by the end of this decade, according to the 15-degree orb of Rictarnus. And then the exact hit of Eris with Pluto, it's pretty close in the triple conjunction of November. I don't know which dates you like to use, but November of 2020, it's within a degree of exact to the Pluto Jupiter that's there. So this is throwing Eris right into the picture. And right now, even, we have a parallel between Pluto and Saturn. So Pluto and Saturn are already connected in that way of parallel, at the same time as we still have Uranus-Pluto with an orb of 10 degrees, which is a square, according to his system. And I think we are in the midst of massive transformation. And what I believe is that Eris seems to be about being a feminine warrior, being a warrior for what you most deeply believe, what you cannot not do. And it has to do with this idea of standing up for what that is, no matter what. So this is, excuse me, my phone's going.
So Henry, while you're checking your phone, just the idea, question that I have is, do you have insights, having worked with Eris, written a book about it, all these things, you have insights that you could share with people who are listening about how to work with this so they can maximize their time, be most conscious, and, you know, and with this idea that we inform the mysteries as much as they inform us, so how do we engage what's going on so that we can help this transition? I think of us as being the transition team, right?
It's kind of like, how do we invite Eris to the party?
Yes.
Because remember what happened last time?
Right.
In the mythic story, she wasn't invited to the party, and
Totally got her.
the elements destroyed the matrilineal civilization of Troy.
Right. So,
well, what we want to do is we want to become more aware of our deepest values.
yes.
That's what the bottom line is with Eris. In other words, these exemplars of Eris, and there are many. I don't know how many people know Terence McKenna, but you know, he was a person that totally articulated his own vision, and it was strictly his own way of looking at things. He was very passionate about it. I was giving a lecture about Eris up in San Francisco, and somebody raised their hand and said, "Have you looked at the chart of Terence McKenna?" And I said, "No, but I'm sure he's a strong exemplar of Eris." And you can just see it, you know, like I looked at the chart recently of Travis Kalanick, who is the CEO of Uber, who got so much press for the way he kind of handled things. Steve Jobs is another example of strong Eris. I mean, you know, just no matter what, I mean, whoever I have to beat up verbally, Steve Jobs, I will do so, you know, and make the thing happen. And Travis is another one that's kind of like that, you know, make the thing happen. And I looked, and sure enough, he's got a strong Eris. I don't remember the exact configuration off the top of my head. I can include the chart and the set of charts for this talk if you want. But, you know, it's just fascinating to me how easy it is to spot. You know, so for this chart for Terence McKenna, I said, I haven't looked at his chart, but I'd like to say that he would be a strong exemplar of Eris. He was somebody who totally went his own way. Well, Eris is across from all the other planets. It's in a hemisphere all by itself, and it makes a trine to his Mars Mercury. So, I mean, perfect for such a strong articulator and writer of his own vision. You know, if you know anything about him, he's just passionate for what his own unique vision was. So that's what we all need to try to find is, you know, and it really is the secret of happiness. You know, I mean, as Joseph Campbell articulated, follow your bliss. Find out what it is that you need to do, that only you feel so strongly about, because it's your unique contribution. It's where can you put your shoulder to the wheel? You know, it's one thing to talk about, here's the situation, culture is disintegrating around us, and what can we do about it? And it can be a feeling of powerlessness. So my prescription based on Eris is investigate that part of yourself, and you can use the astrology to help you do that. What house is your Eris in? What connections does it make with your personal planets? And look into that, and look into what that might mean. I have the interpretations in the latest version of the Time Passages software. You can click on all those things in natal charts, or you can get the book, which has a cookbook. It has a cookbook section in the back about connections with personal planets or other planets, and connections with by the house position, which is turning out to be very, very powerful and indicative. Something about that house is really strong for you. But anyway, or other methods, you don't have to look at the astrology in order to use your intuition to find out what it is that you most deeply espouse. And the thing is, once you know what you stand for, really you're kind of okay. It's like you don't have this feeling of helplessness that what can I do? I can't seem to do anything. This train wreck, is happening, and it's beyond my power or control. Well, if you are really sure about where you stand, and you guys are good examples of this, you and Caylin, you and Daniel both, you can just say, well, this is where we stand. This is what we particularly stand for, and we'll work for that, and whatever else happens, this is where we stand, and so be it, and you can be quite content in that. I think finding personal meaning is so important, and in everybody's life, anybody that's lucky enough to find what their purpose is, what they really are here for, is empowered in that way. And because of Eris being discovered at the time that it was discovered and named, and here we are in this 21st century, in the second decade, and here we are trying to figure out what we're up to as a culture, as individuals. You expect that there is that issue in the zeitgeist corresponding to the meaning of this planet, and I believe it's time. And certainly we're beginning to see that, aren't we? I believe it's time for everybody to stand up for themselves, to find out where do you stand? What is it that you most, and of course sometimes fear keeps us away from it. It's like, oh, I couldn't give up my job because I wouldn't have the money, but I have to do this anyway. And you figure out a way to do it. You figure out a way to get the money and do what you're doing and manage to do the other thing that really matters to you. And there's so much time for that. And of course, that's what we're seeing with this kind of everybody starting to articulate, well, this is where we have to make our moves, the environmental issues. We have to stand up for something there. We have to make our moves, as they did in Standing Rock, and I just think that that's really kind of, so the years leading up to 2020, I believe, are the important years. I mean, we don't want to sit around and wait for 2020 and say, everything's going to change now. No, how's it going to change? It's only going to change when we do something about it.
I thought we should be doing this a few years ahead, because it's just going to continue to accelerate. And it's without some sense of what are the factors from different perspectives, but then also how you can prepare for it. And every one of the speakers is going to have their own view on this. But I had a question for you. And just based on your work with Eris, one thing that occurred to me, since it is something that is moving so slowly, okay, it's going to have quite a pronounced signature on different generations, okay? So I was thinking of the ramifications of the whole group of folks that are the Pluto in Libra generation. And one of the things it's a very major generalization right now, but my experience with that generation, with that group of folks, is that they generally are not very good at being clear about what their own personal convictions are. They basically go with whatever peer group they're with, so there's like a whole variety of different approaches to that. But if you try to pin them down, what do you really believe, it's very difficult for them to come up with an answer. So if you think of that whole generation with the with Eris squaring that I'm sorry, posing that
Posing.
I think it's an interesting inquiry. It just occurred to me.
Very. Why don't you give the years for Pluto and Libra generation? Do you know the years?
Well, do you remember that right off the top of your head? It's
1970 something to
no, it was Virgo. No, Virgo ended in early, yeah. So
early
about
70s.
mid 70s until it went into
Scorpio in
yeah.
the like 83
Right.
or 4 something like that.
Right. So it's kind of a consensus reality kind of generation, Pluto and Libra. Just obviously exceptional.
Well, it's interesting because I find those people to also be rather more open to spirituality. Myself, I mean, I've noticed I really one tends to get cynical and despairing, but generation by generation, I really find that those younger people, they're coming into their power at this time, and they are in their late 30s, I guess, right?
The comment I made is not be disparaging of that generation, but rather that it's possible that Eris's contribution to that generation is to do the very thing that you're espousing, which is to not just look to your peer group, but to just really find out what you yourself stand for. Yeah, it is true. They can be open to spirituality, but in a sort of a less substantial way, not with some degree of ability to stand truly for who you are and who you really are, as opposed to looking into the eyes of other people. So I mean, that's just a thought.
Well, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, and I think that's a great truth, and I think it applies almost to everybody that you don't find very many people that are like Terence McKenna, that are like so committed to what they themselves, this is where I believe, this is where I not only believe, but I want to put all my marbles, this is where I feel called, you might say, that this is my sole purpose, my destiny. You don't find many people that really do it. I mean, you do find, and those are people that we've heard of, people that are outstanding in their field, like Carl Jung, like Joseph Campbell. But I think the majority of people need to kind of tune in. Where do I stand? And perhaps even more so that generation. The opposition with Pluto, when it gets close, depending on where the early ones wouldn't be. It's around the middle of Aries and the middle of Libra that we'd be talking about. But when that Eris-Pluto opposition is prominent in the chart, that's kind of a bulldozer person. They are very, they can make things happen. And the question becomes, okay, you can make things happen. What do you want to do with that? What do you want to make happen? And I think that's where they do need to.
The fear around making it happen and how that could, I think it's great to know what you stand for, but then how do we clear the blocks that are in the way of us really being able to stand for what we stand for? So how can Eris
that's a great
help us
point.
do that? How can, with her strength, with her wisdom, with her willingness to disrupt what's been so something new can come in, we've got to clear.
And it does take courage.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great point you're making, Caylin, about what is the block, and that it's very true that is in many cases a question of fear, a question of I look at Chiron for that, actually, because you often see, if there's Chiron Sun or if there's Chiron Moon even in the chart, a lot of times they have that, oh no, it couldn't be me. I'm not big enough to do that. I couldn't put myself forward in that way. You talk to people, I talk to clients all the time, and I say, well, you're a very powerful personality. What do you do with that? And they say, well, I'm not always able to articulate. I have it inside me, but it doesn't always come out in action. And we can look into the Chiron at that point and say, well, do you have that fear coming up? If it's legitimate fear, I mean, it might be no, I don't think I can do that because I'm overbooked, and there's no possibility. It would
And
take me
maybe
away from other
underlying
things.
that excuse is the fear, so that we come up
Well,
with
that could be an excuse, or it could be real. I mean, so you can't always say no. I never say no. I must say yes to everything. But when you say no, is that coming from a place of legitimate practical concern, or is that coming from this? Is it an excuse because it's coming from this fear place?
Right.
And
The reason I brought up the Libra issue was because the other issue there was that, well, I can't do what I believe in because what will they think?
That's
What
the
other
secret.
people
there you go.
are thinking of it? And the sense I get of what you're sharing about Eris, and also what I know about her mythologically, is that you have to be willing to go ahead and do it anyway.
Yes, exactly.
And it's a
Exactly, and that's
it's
the
a force
one.
of nature so that you've got to get beyond that fear of repercussions or the fear of what other people are going to think.
There's a great quote from Jung where he said, the person that is doing their conventional thing, that is completely caught up in consensus reality, doesn't really feel comfortable in my presence. They sense that I am not in that mode, and I am not in that mold, and I will not be that kind of way. And he says they kind of shy away. He says they sense nature. He calls it nature, and I think it's true. It is sort of an instinctual force of nature that arises in one when one is determined enough. And but you do have to be able to tune in to what it is and why you want to do it. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So thank you, Henry, for all you've shared so far. And I'm wondering if there's anything more that you want to share with us before we begin to wrap this up.
Well, I just think it's quite fascinating, the coincidence of timing. We can see that this decade, I consider this decade to be such a transitional decade because of Uranus-Pluto. I mean, it is the decade of Uranus-Pluto, just like the 60s were the decade of Uranus-Pluto in terms of the conjunction. So we're seeing a repeat of those 60s values, and to me the question becomes, are they viable? This is the opening square of that conjunction. So are they viable? Can it be that we can have peace, love, and harmony and still put bread on the table and still have an economy that works and still have a society that works? And can we do it without war and conflict to try to get some advantage that way?
I'm totally.
I think with all the money that we've been putting in war, we could do so much better at home, with a peaceful approach, and everybody would respect us and not hate us, So I mean, it's in the areas that we are trying to exercise hegemony. So it's quite an interesting turnaround. And one statistic that I think is really helpful is because it is in the real practical statistical world, is it turns out if you invest in stocks, if you choose a stock that has a woman CEO, you actually have an advantage because those stocks are doing better by and large as a percentage than the ones that have a male. There's not that many, but they are doing okay. And I do think, when the Iroquois gave the founding fathers some of the organizational ideas that became the Constitution of the United States and the two houses, the Congress, the two parts of Congress, and the president, the executive branch, and all the things we learned in beginning history or beginning society, whatever they call those things, American studies. But the Iroquois said, now this is very important. Absolutely do not leave this out. And it was the grandmothers. They said, we always put everything through the council of the grandmothers to make sure it's cool before we do it. And of course, the founding fathers were like, oh, forget that. So I really do think if we had more women in power, which we're starting to see, we're seeing the first viable woman candidate for president. We see it all around the world. There's Germany, briefly the UK, many women leaders, quite a few in different parts of the world. But that kind of thinking or that kind of approach that's inclusive rather than being, let's have a club, that's a white male club, is very important right now. And I think it's what's happening, and I think people are talking about it all over the place and trying to push that idea, So we're seeing the beginnings, at least, of, and what will we see by the end of the decade? That's the question. And I think it's one of us to contribute.
That's woven really beautifully with what are the project of our school. Part of it, and it has to do with why we want to do this Capricornian stellium focus, because for about 10 years right now, up to this point, we've been revisioning Capricorn completely around the idea that it is the circle of grandmothers. That is the Council of Elders. We could call it Grandmother Goat. I mean, it's basically the wisdom of the women who hire and fire the chiefs. And we have to get beyond this more patriarchal view of Capricorn. Capricorn is the elder wisdom of women. It's female sign. I mean, for a much longer period of history, it's a feminine force, not the way it's been seen now. And so having Jupiter and Saturn and Pluto all there together in Capricorn, this is what we're trying. One of the main reasons for why we did this summit is the energizing of these ideas that our founding fathers left out that
yes.
most salient feature. And most of what I do now is I go around the world looking for the cultures that are still matrilineal and looking for their wisdom to help seed what is to come. So I'm so happy you brought that part up.
I'm really happy too, because in this summit, we're actually going to have a section specifically about the circle of grandmothers. So thank you for introducing that and bringing that forth, because it is so important. So important.
There is a modern indigenous council of grandmothers that's important, and I know from pioneers, they have been in pioneers quite a bit. That brings me to another point, which I want to touch on, if I can, if there's still a little time left, which is, they named actually 3 beyond Pluto, or at the same time as Pluto was made a dwarf. And dwarfs have magic power, do they not?
Yes, they do.
They are small, but they're powerful. So the other 2 that were named along with Eris, along with Pluto, were Maki Maki and Haumea. And those are ones that, again, most astrologers are regarding these as planetoids or asteroids. I get it all the time. Well, Eris is an asteroid. And I say, no, it's a planet. And I really feel that it is. I feel it's very important in charts. Well, Maki Maki and Haumea are if they're planets, as they would be according to this scheme that I'm saying, which is dwarf can be put in parenthesis. Dwarf, yes, but planets. Yes. So Maki Maki and Haumea are the first 2 planets that have been named after indigenous gods and goddesses, coincidentally with, so I thought profound connection with nature. And that's been being proved out also. So I'm now I'm working on a new book.
I was going to say, can you tell us the indigenous connection with Haumea and Maki Maki, just so that the listening audience?
Well, sure, yeah. So Maki Maki was the creation god of Rapa Nui, which is the Easter Island culture. And I think it's quite interesting that they had cut down all their trees when they were discovered by the Europeans, and they couldn't fish any longer because they couldn't make the canoes. And that was like a very serious situation that they were in. You flash forward to the early 1900s when Teddy Roosevelt said the same thing about our own resources here in this country. He said, if we cut down all our trees, if we extract all our oil and coal, we won't have anything left. We have to start preserving these resources. Well, you look at his chart, and he had Maki Maki in exact partile conjunction with Eris at the top of the chart in the 10th house. So I think that's quite interesting, since he was the environmental president in that way. I've looked at so many charts of environmentalists, like, I looked at Thoreau, I looked at John Muir, all the people you might think of. Bill McKibben is a modern example. It seems that, and then Haumea, to introduce her mythology, she was the creation goddess of Hawaii. So she's the mother of Pele in Hawaiian mythology. And she was very much about the fecundity of nature. It's always coming up with new forms and new, there's life everywhere, growing everywhere, which they found in the Hawaiian Islands. There was so much life that grew out of that volcanic eruption, which became eventually a very fertile land with lots of different creatures in it. And she gave birth out of all different parts of her body. She regenerated to a youthful form and married her own grandchild and stuff like that. But, so to me, it's the fecundity of nature as far as Haumea is concerned. With Maki Maki, I think of it as a bit more activist. I mean, that is the male of the pair. They both seem to have the meaning of a profound connection with nature. And I've been exploring this in different charts, and I'm working on another book that'll include those two, as well as a mention of these other candidates. There's other ones out there, but they're smaller. And I think it's significant that these have been named.
There is
so,
that I keep reading about in Sky and Telescope that's as big as these other ones. They haven't named it yet.
Ah.
There's another one out there that has not been given a name yet. That's
okay.
about 800, 900 miles wide, actually.
Oh.
I want to just indicate something. This has come up recently with talking to some other people. I don't know, not to be a rascal here, but it might be interesting to look at the chart of the author of that book that blamed the cutting down of the trees by the Rapa Nui Islanders for the destruction of their environment. Because there's been new data in the last couple of years that was completely bogus. It was because of the rats that were on board their canoes. And what the rats did to the roots of the trees, they didn't cut them down. So I mean, that whole collapse of society, blaming it on humans for lack of right. No, it was because that was the reason. Because the book by whatever his name, Jared Diamond or whatever, has caused a lot of misunderstanding about indigenous people. Very, that's just something I want to.
I'll have to look into that, since Maki Maki is so tied, as far as methodologically tied to that culture. That's very interesting. Maybe we have some of those rats running around in our country now, huh?
Right, but I agree with the interpretation you're making about Maki Maki, but it was on that author's chart in a particular way. It directs us to look more deeply into blaming those people for cutting down their own trees. You see what I'm saying? That it was something.
Well, I've not looked at the chart of Jared Diamond, but I will certainly do that.
Yeah.
And see if Maki Maki is prominent. I find it all the time. Like, there's this book called The Monkey Wrench Gang by, gosh, his name is escaping me now, but he's a pretty well-known naturalist. He lived in the desert. He talked about the desert and the beauty of the desert quite a bit. Right. And his thing about the book that he wrote was that you should go ahead and destroy the bulldozers before they cut down the resources. He just was opposed to all of the development in the desert or anything. And he wrote this book called The Monkey Wrench Gang. The purpose of the book being, go ahead and throw the monkey wrench. And so I looked at his chart, and he had Maki Maki with Mercury. Mm-hmm. So, when I see Mercury, and he didn't have Haumea, so I think that the Maki Maki side of a lot of other evidence too is a little bit more activist. Than the Haumea, which is more like maybe just the being absorbed with nature, being so full of it in a certain way that can be very powerful. For example, Joseph Campbell has very strong Haumea in his chart, and the nature connection is very profound with Joseph Campbell. He knew a lot about birds and animals. He saw the Wild West shows in the early 1900s and was very interested in the Indians, not so much the cowboys, and studied that right from the beginning. Went to the museums and saw the totem poles and things like that. And so even as a child, he was very interested in indigenous. And he said later in his life that the whole purpose of mythology, a living mythology, which we can look at the past, but we don't have a living mythology today so much. But the whole purpose is to connect us with instinct and nature in a profound way. And of course, that's what's lacking in our society now, because the old institutions that used to do that are a kind of dying breed. They're just a hollow shell, speaking of all the fundamentalist religions. And we need something to take their place in a more modern way. And I believe that astrology can be a cornerstone of understanding that there's more magic in the universe than we give credit for. And at least then when I say we, the culture, the consensus culture gives credit for.
I love that. It's so well said. So, so I would love then for you, Henry, to tell people how they can find you.
Yes.
Yeah. So that if they're
well, that's a good point. Yeah. So the book is called The 10th Planet. If you're interested in knowing more about Eris specifically. And my website is called Astrograph.com, where we have the time passages software where you can explore astrology. If you're new to astrology, it's very good for self-teaching. And Astrograph.com is spelled Astrograph, 10 letters straight out, Astrograph, astrology writing. And so there's a lot of free content on the site as well. And we do a monthly description of what's happening for each sign. And well, we have resources there, and we run the time passage software runs on both Windows and Mac, natively on Mac, which is a nice feature of it. And then, of course, we have the iPhone. So it's the most popular astrology app on the iPhone is Time Passages. And you can get a free version, excuse me, and you can also get the Pro for $30, and then you don't have to keep paying 99 cents per chart. So that's the way that works. And we, of course, everybody asks us, when's it coming out on Android? And we always say, very soon now. And it's been a few years we've been trying to get the Android project to a better stage of completion, and now we're finally, we're hoping that by the end of the year we'll be closer there.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
I said it'll be really soon now.
Hey, really, really soon. Yes, yes, this year, probably.
Awesome. Thank you, Henry, for being a part of this. We love what you had to share with us. Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And stay tuned
Thank you so much.
for